That's how it usually goes, right? No, that's how it is. No, I tried. Okay, well, moving on. Godzilla the series was released in 1999 for the Game Boy Color, and to make a long story short, it is a slow, plodding, and not particularly good game. However, this must have done well enough in sales because a year later we got a sequel. Godzilla the series Monster Wars, also for the Game Boy Color, courtesy of Crave and Crawfish Interactive. Monster Wars is based on the 3-part Monster Wars episode, which is essentially the cartoon's version of Destroy All Monsters, and is generally considered to be the series' best storyline, or so I've been led to believe. But while the new animated intro might bring your hopes up into thinking this might be an improvement over the previous game, or even better, an entirely new thing that isn't boring, the opening cutscene with the same talking heads as the previous game confirms the dire suspicion that Monster Wars is virtually the same game as its predecessor, with some supposed improvements. Well, okay, there's one improvement at least. Boss battles now have music. It's not great, I'd be hard-pressed to call it good even, but at least it isn't brain-dead silence. That's reserved for the rest of the game. The rest of this dreadful game. Monster Wars retains the same gameplay as its predecessor. Godzilla remains on the left side of the screen because he's just so big, and he has to move to the right constantly while fending off enemies that can bombard him with bullets. Unlike the previous game, however, Monster Wars is not an auto-scroller, as the game decides to let you move Godzilla by holding right on the D-pad. So on the one hand, you have slightly more control over Godzilla's actions, though the main gist is still tilting Godzilla's head up and down to aim your fireball shots, but at least you now have a targeting reticule to give you a general idea as to where you're aiming. You also have immediate access to all his regular attacks: Fireball, Tail Whip, Foot Stomp, Bite, and Claw Swipe, with all the melee attacks executed with combination D-pad and button inputs. In theory, at least. Newly added to your arsenal of completely ineffective and utterly worthless attacks is Fire Breath, which allows Godzilla to fire a continuous stream of atomic fire by holding the select button, which is not bad in theory, except your fire breath has a limited range and is also tied to your new fire meter, which you'll need to refill by collecting the appropriate pickups. Yeah, that's right, kids. Monster Wars now has item pickups, and for anyone who has played the previous game or seen the last video, first off, my condolences in both cases. But secondly, you'll recall that in that game, you had regenerating health and guard meters. That's out the window now. You want a refill, you'll need to hit enemies and hope they drop an appropriate refill icon for you to pick up by shooting at them. Pickups is also how you will slowly but surely level up your appropriate attacks and even extend your health meter, which used to be done by scoring enough points, and now... Well, you know what? I will give Monster Wars credit in this regard. It is certainly less of a cakewalk than the previous game was, and certainly nowhere near as brain dead. Unfortunately, in the case of a game like this, that is not entirely a good thing. Monster Wars may have tweaked some things, but other legacy issues from the previous game remain. Primarily with controls, which continue to find new ways to be an absolute clusterfuck beyond its one main issue from the previous game, which is the extremely laggy response time with about a second pause between button input and execution. This makes melee attacks virtually worthless, and that's assuming you could pull them off because aside from the tail whip, which is done with the B button, other moves require D-pad and button combinations to execute, such as the foot stomp executing by pressing down and A. And sometimes, these don't work because, again, you have that horrid input delay. I also found the fireball targeting to be particularly jank, almost having a slippery feel to it, as I would sometimes aim downwards, but the reticule would jump upwards again, throwing off my aim. It's happened to me a couple times and it's always irritated me. Like I said, controls find new ways of being shitty in these horrid Godzilla games. The gameplay itself also hasn't changed all that much despite tweaks to the controls and other such things. Godzilla is still restricted to the left side of the screen, moving to the right, occasionally taking out grunt army men, tanks, and aircraft that will occasionally pop up, except now sometimes they'll drop pickups whenever you kill them. Sometimes, not always. Again, makes the game a bit less brain dead, but not by much. Monster Wars does feature more monster battles than the previous game, but again, because both monsters are stuck to their side of the screen, what should be a highlight in any kaiju game worth its salt is relegated to a glorified trading of the fireballs to see who croaks first. But hey, the game still has passwords. You could toggle the number of lives/continues, choose from 2 difficulty settings, not that it means anything, and toggle whether you want the music and or sound effects on or off. Graphically speaking, Monster Wars is on par with the previous game. Godzilla still looks fairly decent and animates fairly well for a character his size, and for what it's worth, the boss monsters you fight aren't too bad looking either, even if they are somewhat limited in scope. They did add a couple new backgrounds that look a bit more colorful and perhaps a bit too busy at times, but for the most part, there's some recycled assets to be found here, and it's just as dull as ever regardless. Once again, the main gameplay portions and the cutscenes are lacking in music, but now there's music in the boss fights. They're not particularly great, but at least it's something. Aside from that, you get very tinny sound effects that sound very tinny. And also on the bright side, they did improve the quality of the digitized Godzilla roar, so at least it sounds like what it's supposed to. It's not great, but it's a step up at least. Overall, Godzilla the series Monster Wars is still not a very good game. Yes, there's a couple upgrades to make the game slightly less boring and provide players with a bit more challenge that isn't entirely brain dead, but the gameplay is still a sloth, the controls are still horribly laggy, and it's just more of the same old tripe. Now, if somehow you found some semblance of enjoyment from the previous Godzilla the series game, then Monster Wars may also be to your liking. But for everyone else, the one big improvement I will give Monster Wars credit on, perhaps the most vital improvement of all, is that it did not spawn another horrible sequel. And to that I say, thank fuck for that. I have nothing else to say. I'm left with nothing but a bunch of blood-stained memories that I'd much rather forget. I'm going to bed. Good night.